Thank you very much, Florian, for that kind introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I actually think the future of money is the most important issue in economics today and over the coming years. So, just a little bit more about the Cobden Center, which is the economics think tank that I run. The Cobden Center was founded by UK Member of Parliament Steve Baker and entrepreneur Toby Baxendale, and we're really an Austrian School of Economics think tank. So we work a lot in business cycle theory, trade theory, and similar areas. Steve, our founder, was chair of the all-party parliamentary group in economics, money and banking in the UK Parliament, and was also on the Treasury Select Committee for 2 or 3 years. So he was also really on the front line. For instance, on the Treasury Select Committee, he will be questioning Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, and so on. So it's really a rare opportunity to put Austrian school economics into practice in that sense. So we've got a lot of contributors, economists, MPs, MEPs as well. Some of them you may have heard of, like Dominic Frisby, who wrote one of the best-selling books on Bitcoin. But we've really developed a very strong interest in digital currencies and blockchain technology over the last few years. I've been running the Cobden Center for Steve since 2014, and really so I started looking at opportunities for things that we could do to promote this area. We see it as something that's really in tune with the Austrian School of Economics. So one of our contributors is a member of the European Parliament, Dr. Syed Kamal, who is head of the Conservatives group in the European Parliament. So as the head of one of the major groups in the European Parliament, he has the opportunity to have an exhibition on a subject of his choosing at some point during his 5-year tenure in the Parliament. So Syed kindly gave us the opportunity to run a 5-day-long exhibition in the European Parliament on digital currencies and blockchain technology. So attending this event, we managed to get the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements, the OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations, and Europol, among others, all attending. So it's the first time all of these groups had ever attended a digital currencies event. And then we also had 1 or 2 companies from each sector, like we had the NASDAQ Stock Exchange, Microsoft, and a lot of other startups and academics as well. So it's a very interesting event, and we've stayed in touch with them. And what we're doing now is actually putting together like a document summarising a lot of their views, some short papers. So we'll be able to touch on a few of those things today as well. So really, one of the key things that we focus on as well is, as Florian said, is the educational aspect. So as an Austrian school think tank, we're not just focused on the digital currency side. For instance, next month we're actually giving a seminar at the Bank of England on the Austrian School of Economics. So that will be one of the first, if not the first, Austrian school seminars done at the Bank of England. And we're hoping to then do that at other central banks and perhaps other institutions as well. So one of the key values that we have at the Cobden Center is that honest money is necessary for a free society. So, what is honest money? Well, honest money may take many different forms, but we can certainly say that what it doesn't involve is corporate cronyism and economic inefficiency. And I think actually the best way that we can achieve honest money in the long term is through competition, just like other sectors of the economy. And I think blockchain technology really enables this like never before. So, government monopolies, as we all know, as all economists know, do not have a good track record in really almost any sector of the economy. And money makes up half of every transaction over our lifetimes. Therefore, monopoly power in this area should be up for discussion just like any other. That's one of our key points. In 1999, the economist Milton Friedman, in an interview, gave a quite prophetic statement. He said, and I quote, "I think that the internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government." the one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash, a method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A. Now, I think this idea really started to come to fruition with Bitcoin. So what Bitcoin needed to do was to allow people to make payments to each other without a central authority. So in order to achieve this, Bitcoin really needed to solve several problems. Principally, it needed to maintain the integrity of a ledger system in order to prevent double spending of money and prevent theft and fraud. And it needed to do this all without a central caretaker. So there's no one in charge of Bitcoin as such. So Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin, created a distributed ledger, which is known as a blockchain. So in the case of Bitcoin, the blockchain is a ledger system which anybody can download and see all of the transactions which have ever occurred. This means that the ledger is actually replicated on a lot of different computers at any one time. And when the transactions are approved on the blockchain, all of the copies of the ledger are then updated. So verification of the transactions is done by computers all around the world who get paid in Bitcoin for verifying those transactions. So not all of these points are really necessary for every blockchain system, but they're what came together to create the Bitcoin blockchain. And as we'll see today, it really was radically innovative. So what it means is, in essence, people can exchange assets, in that case Bitcoin, in a way that does not require a ledger managed by any kind of central body, like for instance a stock market, a bank, or PayPal, or whatever it might be. So there are really only a few precedents for a ledger system this innovative in the history of economic thought. The ancient Mesopotamians had crucial developments in their mathematics through their development of ledger systems. Then later on, in 1494, Luca Pacioli invented double-entry bookkeeping, or was at least the first to write about it. Pacioli is often called the father of accounting, and also taught mathematics to Leonardo da Vinci. So those modern accounting methods from the Renaissance were really the enzyme for the rise of the banking dynasties like the Medici. The 17th and 18th centuries then saw the rise of stock markets in London, Amsterdam, and elsewhere. And I would argue that what stock markets were to the first great age of globalization, blockchain will be to the second great age of globalization, that is the internet age. So with blockchain technology, money becomes something materially different. The money itself becomes programmable, so contracts could be programmed into the blockchain. So for instance, payment can only occur when each side of a contract has been fulfilled. So what, where, when and under what circumstances the money transfers can be programmed into the blockchain. So to take an example, let's say some of the parents here, if you had a child at university and you wanted to send them some money to be spent on textbooks, you can actually program into that money that that's what it has to be spent on. Some of the rest of you here may not be such a fan of that concept. So what else can blockchain be used for? Well, some examples include stocks and bonds, the registering and trading of intellectual property, and networks of smart contracts. So at the moment, some of the stock exchanges currently rolling out or looking at blockchain include the NASDAQ, as I mentioned earlier, also the Korea Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, and the Tokyo Stock Exchange, among others. And this is for areas varying from securities issuance and transfer to clearing and settlement and enforcing derivatives contracts. IBM and Samsung are currently using blockchain for the Internet of Things, so that devices can communicate with no need for a central hub. Companies like Augur are effectively globalized, decentralized prediction networks. So you'll be able to bet on anything from sports to stocks, again, without any kind of central betting house. It'll be purely peer-to-peer. While trading networks like OpenBazaar are effectively like a peer-to-peer version of Amazon. So there's no central company managing it. So obviously the talk today is on money. Now, not all of these blockchain systems have money intrinsically, but many of them actually have money embedded into the blockchain network. So I think we need to stop thinking of digital currencies as just being a separate application like Bitcoin. Actually, money is going to be more and more embedded into these specific networks. So if we look at our current ledger system, which forms the banking and financial system, it's essentially pyramidal. So in other words, you have central banks at the top of the pyramid. You then have participant banks below that with their reserves at the central bank. And then below that you have smaller financial institutions and individuals. So, for example, in the US, you have 3,000 member banks, which have reserves at the Fed. And then those reserves are then moved between each bank using what's called FedWire, which processes hundreds of trillions of dollars of transactions every year. Now, with blockchain technology, essentially this whole pyramid ledger structure, which serves as our current financial system, can become distributed. So, some of you may be aware a lot of the banks are looking at using blockchain, and a lot of it is really just to do with banks settling with each other and that type of thing. Whereas in actual fact, this structure for the economy really allows a complete revolution, at least as revolutionary as the change that happened with the beginning of banking during the Italian Renaissance. So I think in only a few years, we'll look back at our current system and we'll really marvel at how primitive it was. So you look at some international bank transfers now, and they can take several days. For my company, which Florian mentioned, we are getting some deals in the US, and one of the companies there wanted to pay us by check. So I went to my bank in the UK and I said, well, how long will it take to process a check from the US? And they said, well, that can take up to 4 weeks for clearance. So to put that into perspective, the SS Royal William, the first steamship to cross the Atlantic in 1831, did so in only 25 days. I'm writing a paper at the moment for a book, and the title I've given it is that blockchain is the new intellectual battleground within economics, because it's really going to change everything. So it affects not just money, but as I said, trade, property rights, and liberty in general. Money is just one of the applications, and it will be embedded in many of these other applications. So throughout the 20th century, we saw the battle between centrally planned economies and free economies. Of course, nowhere is this more evident than in Germany. It's rare in economics that you could have something like a scientific experiment where different variables are held constant. But in many respects, the two closest that we have to this are Germany during the Cold War and the Korean Peninsula. Now, in general, the economics establishment around the world has accepted free markets over centrally planned economies. So, for instance, in the German example, what would most people prefer to drive? A Mercedes or a Trabant? Another thing that we learned from the GDR is that you cannot have individual liberty without economic liberty. This means economic liberty means not just private property, but also the freedom to trade, and that includes to set prices. This will be important in terms of where our current system is going. So since the Romans, and even before that, price controls have been shown to fail in pretty much every area in which they've been attempted. when the government fixes the price of food or fuel in Venezuela, for instance, we should not be surprised that there are shortages in goods. The Edict of Diocletian in the year 301 set maximum prices throughout the Roman Empire, causing hunger and near social collapse. Now, at the time, philosophers such as Lactantius criticised the edict, pointing out the distortions that it would cause in the economy. Now, although thinkers like Lactantius didn't call themselves economists, what they intuitively understood was that prices are essential for the functioning of an economy and the allocation of scarce resources. Now, in developed economies, we've got used to having goods when we want them. You'd be surprised if you went to the supermarket and the prices were set, like in Cuba or Venezuela. But we do still have one area of the economy where there is systematic price fixing, and that is, of course, central banks setting interest rates. Friedrich von Hayek, the great economist, won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1974 for his exposition of how the manipulation of credit and interest rates causes distortions throughout the economy. So, many of you here today, I know we have some great Austrian school thinkers, will be aware of this theory. But essentially, when interest rates are set too low, it means that prices, in this case interest rates, are no longer sending correct signals to the market. So, similar to when the government sets the price of butter, for instance, if the government was to set the price of butter too low, then you would have too many people wanting butter that is actually available in the economy. You have a similar problem with central banks setting interest rates, in that you end up with essentially too many people borrowing that is actually backed up by the amount of resources in the economy. What this eventually leads towards is, of course, a recession where the capital structure needs to be reordered. Ludwig von Mises used the term Katastrophenhauser, so that actually implies that when you have a boom based on money creation, it contains the seeds of its own destruction in that boom. Now, Friedrich von Hayek also wrote in the 1970s about how private currencies would be the only viable long-term solution to this. That was in several papers that he wrote. So at the time, Hayek was of the view, really, that if you had competition in money, that what it would lead towards would be money backed by a basket of commodities, so gold, silver, platinum, and so on. What we have now, in fact, is the first truly free market in money. And I think it actually exceeds many of the ideas of Friedrich von Hayek. So we now have several hundred digital currencies available. So you probably know some of the more famous ones like Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ether, and so on. But there's actually now really a complete ecosystem in this area. So a couple of examples are Gridcoin, for instance, which came out of the University of California at Berkeley. So with Gridcoin, you actually earn coins by donating computing power from your personal computer to be used for scientific research in physics, mathematics, and medicine. So Stanford University have done something similar with CureCoin. They use supercomputers to study protein folding, and by donating some of your processing power to that, you get paid in newly created CureCoins. Now, when you take into consideration that the Bitcoin network alone now has around 100 times more powerful, more computation than all of Google's servers combined, you realize that this could achieve some quite powerful things over the coming years. So I mentioned earlier the idea of state-run economies versus free economies. And I think what we're going to move towards over the next few years more and more is that private money will seem more and more like a Mercedes, and meanwhile central bank money, with its attendant banking system, will seem more and more like a Trabant. But if we look at what economics students learn today, it's actually very different from this in a lot of areas. So when you look at macroeconomics, what do economics students learn in university? What they learn is actually very un-Hayekian. So they learn dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, ISLM, vector autoregressive models, all these other areas. So essentially what's taught is that the economy is something like a thermodynamic system. So central bankers just push and pull the right levers, and that will cause the economy to grow. So they learn that rather than the idea that really a free economy where people can exchange with each other freely is what creates prosperity. Now, of all the different forms of central planning, I actually think that monetary central planning is perhaps the most insidious of all. So if the state engages in price fixing of, for instance, rubber or butter, as we talked about, then the distortions are going to be relatively localized. On the other hand, with interest rate manipulation by central banks, what you can end up with is a macro boom. So you end up with distortions throughout the economy. So, over the previous decades, the world in aggregate has had steadily falling interest rates, with a larger dose of cheap credit each time there has been a recession, just to get the same level of growth that there was before. So there's been basically a kind of ratcheting down effect by central banks. So what started off as monetary stimulus has really started to have more of the characteristics of something like a narcotic stimulant, where you need a stronger dose each time just to achieve the same effect. What this has led to is that most developed countries are now at the zero bound. In other words, have 0% interest rates or something around that. We now have some countries that even have negative interest rates. The reductio ad absurdum of all modern monetary theory. And we really don't understand the consequences of a lot of this. So if you just suppose for one moment that central banks setting interest rates actually distorts the economy rather than stimulating it, and then you look at negative interest rates, for instance, you'll get some idea of the dire straits that the economy could be getting itself into over this. Another economist who is interesting in this respect for these effects was a French economist called Richard Cantillon. So really, he came up with the idea that when money is created, when it flows into the economy, it doesn't flow out evenly over the economy. So the people who receive that money really benefit from it disproportionately. So when kings would coin new money and then spend it into the economy, the people who were on the receiving end of that would benefit and then can then spend it into the economy. So if you look at, for instance, the quantitative easing which has happened, when the new money is created, the people who benefit disproportionately are the financial sector, and especially the hedge funds and so on. So the Bank of England, in their own paper on this, found that I think it's around 40% of all of the benefits in wealth of QE have gone to the wealthiest 5%. So blockchain technology in the hands of the people will be a direct challenge to all of this. But on the other hand, as some of you may be aware, central banks are also looking at using blockchain technology. So, for instance, the chief economist at the Bank of England, in his speech, How Low Can You Go?, talked about banning cash and replacing it with a blockchain-based money. So what this would mean is that radical monetary policy, like negative interest rates, can then be implemented, but with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide for savers. So essentially the types of bubbles that we're seeing that Hayek would predict from low interest rates are going to be growing and growing and growing with this type of technology in the hands of central banks. Also, I mentioned earlier some of the features of a blockchain-based money. The idea that the money itself becomes programmable, so you can program into it how it can be spent. So with the central bank issued blockchain money, the state would also have that power. So in the UK, I don't know if you have the term here, but we use the term nanny state for a government which is overprotective of its citizens. It's acting almost like a nanny. So with a central bank run blockchain currency, essentially with a push of a button, all pocket money can be taken away. So this is supercharging that concept. I mean, in my view, if you look at the way the current structure is going, with the years now of low interest rates, I think we may well be approaching the denouement of the current system anyway. So we now have an $80 trillion global bond bubble, or something in that region. McKinsey did a study on global debt levels, and since 2007, during the period of supposed deleveraging, the global economy actually added around $57 trillion of new debt to well over $200 trillion. And I think also by most traditional metrics now, stock markets are now their most overvalued, certainly in the US and elsewhere, since 1929, just before the Great Depression. Also, a lot of the money, artificially cheap credit that's been created, is actually coagulated in the bond market rather than stocks. So, when Venezuela fixes the price of food and they get hungry citizens, we're not surprised. So when central banks fix interest rates, we should not be surprised that we have a $200 trillion plus global debt bubble. You can't have economic growth dependent on stuffing consumers with more and more debt, like foie gras. So I think with Mises' concept of the Katastrophenhauser, I think what we're really heading for is, essentially what we have is a global asset bubble that's so extensive that it's in virtually all asset classes worldwide now. So Ludwig von Mises said, and I'm going to quote him on this, "True, governments can reduce the rate of interest in the short run. They can issue additional paper money. They can open the way to credit expansion by the banks. They can thus create an artificial boom and the appearance of prosperity, but such a boom is bound to collapse sooner or later and to bring about a depression." So he then continued, "There's no means of avoiding a final collapse of the boom brought about by credit expansion." So I think that's what's facing us at the moment, is it's really, we're seeing the rise of these new types of money based around the blockchain. But really just at the same time, I think our current monetary and financial system is really bursting at the seams with all of the artificially cheap credit that's been created. And that is now virtually all central banks engaging in this simultaneously. Obviously, very strongly since 2008, but it was even going on before that. This has been going on for decades now. So, I sometimes, when I give speeches on the future of money, I sometimes like to quote Faust. And of course, here in Leipzig, this is where Mephistopheles took Faust for his first sojourn to Auerbach's cellar. In Faust Part 2, the empire has run out of money. The emperor himself is lamenting that there's nothing left. The commanders of the army are saying that they can't pay the military. So Mephistopheles comes to the emperor and says, well, why don't we just essentially print money to pay the bills? Now what he actually says is what we'll do is we'll take the gold that's still in the ground that hasn't been mined yet, and we'll create promissory notes based on that gold. So it's actually a debt-based monetary system that Mephistopheles proposes, rather than pure chartism. Of course, the emperor says to him, I'm sick and tired of how and when. We're short of money, so make it then. So they go ahead and they create the paper money system. And of course it gets going, and there's a boom, just like there has been with zero interest rates. So the shops are full, the money lenders are lending, they can finally pay the army, and so on and so on. Everything's good, certainly for a while. As the Chancellor says, see and hear the scroll, heavy with destiny, that's changed to happiness our misery. To whom it concerns, may you all know, this paper's worth 1,000 crowns or so. And so it continues, more and more. Mephistopheles, of course, leads them on, saying, such paper's convenient, for rather than a lot of gold and silver, you know what you've got. You've no need of bartering and exchanging. Just drown your needs in wine and lovemaking. So, of course, the boom that's generated in Faust Part 2 is similar to the boom that the world has had over the previous few years. It is really the product of a lot of money creation, and it's going to come to an end in a bad way. So, of course, in Faust, they have their own Katastrophenhauser. In other words, the boom that was created had the seeds of its own destruction built into it. So actually, Jens Weidmann, the president of the Bundesbank, has also, on a couple of occasions, quoted Faust. And he said, the state in Faust Part 2 is able at first to rid itself of its debts, while consumer demand grows strongly and fuels a strong recovery. But this later develops into inflation, and the monetary system is destroyed by rapid currency depreciation. So we have to bear in mind all of this. Over the coming years, you're going to see more and more private forms of money based around the blockchain. So some of them will be pure money systems like Bitcoin, but a lot of them are going to actually have the money essentially embedded into the network. So there'll be prediction networks, which will involve betting on anything from sports to stocks and so on. And they will have their own money built into them in many cases. So, given this, what effect will regulation have on blockchain-based currencies? There's obviously been a few ideas that have been either proposed or implemented so far. So some of them include, for instance, treating Bitcoin just as another currency, or treating it as a financial asset. We had the BitLoy license in New York, and then some countries obviously have even banned digital currencies. So one of the things we need to bear in mind when we look at this is that the success rate for government regulators with new technology has been patchy at best. So in the late 19th century, we had the first regulations for the automobile, or the horseless carriage, as it was then known. So for instance, in the UK, we had what was called the red flag laws, where anybody driving an automobile had to have someone walking 60 yards ahead, carrying a red flag, warning of the approaching horseless carriage. Various states in America actually implemented similar concepts as well. Pennsylvania actually took things one step further, where anybody with a horseless carriage, upon an encounter with cattle, had to immediately and as rapidly as possible disassemble the automobile and conceal the various components out of sight behind nearby bushes. So you see regulators trying to deal with new technologies. Generally, not only do they not grasp where it's going to go, but they're really viewing it from their current level of technology. They looked at the car, and what they saw was a horseless carriage. Now, in 1896, the red flag laws were repealed in the UK, and Lord Winchelsea symbolically tore up a red flag in front of Parliament. People then celebrated by driving from London to Brighton in their horseless carriages. But in the way the damage had already been done, and a lot of innovation had already been stifled. The same thing happened in the US, where there was a lot of restrictive regulations there. So I think that's one of the key things that regulators will have to bear in mind, is really that blockchain-based money is not just a currency with no central bank, in the same way that the automobile was not just a horseless carriage. So blockchain-based money is really something materially different that has the potential to revolutionise a lot of our trading systems today, both in finance and beyond. One of the other concepts from the Austrian school that's important to understanding a lot of this comes from an economist called Fritz Machtler. So he actually coined the term the information society, I think back in the 60s, which is obviously relevant today. But he also coined another term, which is moneyness. And that's really this idea that a lot of different assets can have money-like characteristics under different circumstances. This is something that's going to be important in a lot of these types of blockchain networks. So, for instance, the Bank of England, when they wrote one of their main papers on digital currencies, they also talked about the same concept. This idea that, for instance, in prisons, cigarettes were used as currency. So a lot of different things can take on money-like characteristics in different circumstances. Even Aristotle and Copernicus both talked about this concept as well. So when you bear in mind, for instance, with the Bitcoin blockchain, from around 2012 and 13, various other innovations started occurring where people would start to attach assets to fractions of Bitcoin on the blockchain. So they're often known as colored coins. So for instance, you could attach anything from intellectual property to stocks and bonds to fractions of Bitcoin on the blockchain. So you start to really get this concept of moneyness that Matt spoke about. I think increasingly, even at the moment, most of the products that you buy online are now digitized. So for instance, music, movies, books and so on are now pretty much completely digitized. With 3D printing, you're going to find that effectively a lot of quote-unquote physical products can also be digitized. So that's really perfect for a blockchain economy. But that also really changes this concept of moneyness. If you have a lot of assets on the blockchain, then, for instance, you could be paid in gold, or whatever you want to be paid in. You're not really reliant on something like Bitcoin. So for regulators, that's going to create a lot of other challenges. In the 1990s, peer-to-peer networks challenged the copyright industry. So the copyright industry really tried to take on the peer-to-peer networks head-on. And like the Hydra in ancient Greek mythology, every time they cut off a head, two more would grow in its place. So blockchain will present similar difficulties for a lot of industries at the moment, not just in finance, but also beyond, but also for the regulators. It's really difficult to define a lot of these terms that are going to be used. What is and is not money. Friedrich von Hayek, when he was talking about arguments against centrally planned economies, said, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." So I think this is a very strong case. When you look at things like the bit license in New York, I mentioned we're publishing some things at the moment from Europol and OECD and other groups that were at the European Parliament event. So one of the things is, they assume that you can, most of the time, they assume that you can differentiate quite easily between what is and is not money. And I think there's going to be a lot of grey areas as this area develops. So in summary, what does this mean for our current political and monetary system? The way that blockchain is developing, this kind of anarchic system. Well, this Sunday, while I'm in Leipzig, I also have the pleasure of going to see Wagner's great opera, Götterdämmerung. And in that opera, or in the Ring Cycle, the series, Wotan, the king of the gods, really gets himself to a position where he's beyond the point of no return. And there's a kind of inexorable progress towards the end of Götterdämmerung, which is the destruction of the gods. I think when you look at the last few years of our current system, and you see essentially every recession leading to more and more credit creation and a larger dose of artificially cheap credit every time, they're on a similar path. In 2015, in Jackson Hole, I gave a speech at an event there. Essentially, every year, as you may be aware, in Jackson Hole, central bankers get together there. It's in Wyoming. The heads of the main central banks from all around the world get together. And in 2015, they actually ran 2 alternative events there. One of them had Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, involved. And then we had another one there as well, which was really a group of think tanks and economists and politicians. So there's the Council on Foreign Relations and the Cato Institute and so on. And different ideas for alternative monetary systems were talked about at this event over 2 days. So for instance, people talked about the gold standard, nominal GDP targeting and so on. And actually that event in 2015 was the first time I gave a speech about blockchain, and there it was still, digital currencies were still seen as something, people didn't really take Bitcoin that seriously. They were more interested in more traditional forms of monetary reform. This year, on the other hand, there's a book being published by a think tank, the Ludwig von Mises Institute Europe in Brussels. And I know there's actually 1 or 2 contributors here today as well. And they have a chapter on the future of monetary systems based around the Austrian school. And I know that around 3/4 of all the papers submitted to that chapter actually involve blockchain at some level. So really, just in the last couple of years, this has changed radically from being a bit of a fringe idea among economists at least, to being something that whenever people look at the future of money, they realise that this is going to be a central concept. At the moment, our entire economic model, as I said, is based on this idea that central banks contain the business cycle through the central planning of money and credit. So if you accept this idea, then blockchain will allow detailed central planning by central banks like never before. So they'll be able to implement radical monetary policy like negative interest rates and effectively see in real time what's happening on the blockchain. As well as this, in extremis, the state will effectively be able to seize people's assets with the push of a button. And also you can even program into the blockchain what money can be spent on. On the other hand, if you believe that free prices and free exchange and free markets are what produce prosperity, then you can see that a central bank-controlled blockchain or state-controlled blockchain will lead to malinvestment really on a level that hasn't been possible before, because you'll be able to have concepts like negative interest rates with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide for the saver. But what we really have right now is something that happens very rarely in economic history, and that is the possibility to create a new monetary system. So if you do believe in freedom, we have the power now to create a monetary system that's not controlled by powerful people, but by all of us, and one that does not transfer wealth from the real economy to the financial sector, but in fact minimises the financial sector. One that does not control who we can trade with, but frees us to trade with whom we please. So for all of us who believe in freedom and free markets, the most important battleground right now in economics is how blockchain will be implemented. And this battle really must be won to safeguard a free society and a free economy. I think everyone here today has a role to play in that. Thank you very much.
So, we would have, is it on? No. would have time for another 5 minutes of questions and comments, if there are any. Give me 10 seconds to think about it. If not, Max, thank you very much for speaking here today, for a very thought-provoking talk, and I think you will be around and with us for the coffee break.
That's right, yeah.
And we will meet again at 5 sharp for our last session of the day with Professor